Intimidating friends. This happened back in high school, involving one very dear friend and his manic sociopath of a buddy. Let me outline the cast of this beautiful production. First, there was our victim, who was possibly just the nicest dude I have ever encountered in my life. I'll call him Nice Dude. His home life was pretty good, while it was just him and his mother. His mother was incredibly busy, working a very high-paying job to give him a comfortable life, and as such, she wasn't home often. So to make up for that, and to assure her son, and so, of course, being a teenager with more expendable income than he knew what to do with, he constantly blew it on weed, electronics, and nice clothes. Despite his comfortable living situation, he was, by and large, just a great dude. Always spent money on his friends, shared his weed, had movie nights. Honestly, I think he just felt a little lonely and wanted to share what he had with people he cared about. Then, we have the agent of chaos in this story. We'll call this absolute effing Maverick Horse, due to an equally illogical high school nickname that he demanded everyone call him. Horse and I were buddies, mainly due to equal parts self-preservation and edgy teen nihilism that simply wanted to release his special brand of unhinged out into the world. He was the friend you made because it was not a matter of if he got sent to jail, but when, and you'd really rather not have your name be part of that headline. This wasn't to say that Horse was a bad dude. Talking to him was pretty chill for the most part, and I genuinely enjoyed our time together. But you got the vibe that there was this underlying problem going untreated. A nice enough dude if you were friends, didn't even really ever argue with people, but if you wronged him, then you might as well skip the country and change your name. Horse didn't deal in an eye for an eye. He wanted your teeth, eyes, and maybe a few fingers while he was at it. Horace also bought a wild animal off of someone at school. This is unrelated to the story at hand, but I feel it paints a picture of just the kind of impulsive teenage boy who purchases a wild animal that another teenager clearly just found somewhere outside and brought to school, all without having a single clue of how to care for it. I'm going to leave what type of animal unspecified, as it was the same as his nickname, but we'll say that it was a dog-sized herbivore that lived uncaged in his bedroom floor for several years. If so, on to the story. Nice came to school one day, looking like he just got dragged behind a car for a few blocks. We're talking busted blood vessels in his eyes, scrapes and cuts, as well as several swollen bits on his face. He was, and still is, I suppose, a very dark-skinned guy. So just how bruised he was, I can't tell you, but I was going to hazard the guess super. Normal friend reactions, including my own, were immediate concern, asking if he needed to go to the hospital, if he was alright, and what happened. Turns out he had invited a few guys over to his place the night before to smoke weed, bought and paid for by him, and play video games. Upon seeing Nice Dude's apartment and all his fancy toys, they decided to repay his kindness by beating the ever-loving stuffing out of him and stealing his stuff. Rational friends told him to file a police report, to which he waved them off, not wanting to cause more issues, not to mention they'd been smoking. Less rational friends suggested he get a gun, which he also declined. Then comes the least rational person in our entourage. Horse had not been present during Nice Dude's explanation of the night before. Being a chaotic nexus of violent urges shaped like a teenage boy, he needed his sleeve, and a lot of it. So he never arrived at school less than an hour late. So he stumbles in as we're moving to a new class, takes one look at Nice Dude, and asks a single question. Who did it? Nice Dude. Being a nice guy who hadn't even wanted police intervention, sure as heck wouldn't sick Horse on these idiots. So he made up some lie about having a concussion and not remembering. Horse didn't buy it and spends the rest of his day up Nice Dude's, but demanding to know the exact names of everyone involved. Nice Dude eventually buckles, reluctantly naming each of the poor idiots who would likely eventually wish they had gone to the cops instead. Of course, first came violent retribution, Horace's favorite kind. Being an absolutely huge dude with no regard for his own safety and well-being and less regard for others, he was a pretty intimidating guy. He spent the rest of the day skipping out on his classes, hunting down each of the guys involved and beating them, quote, until my hands felt wet. Security stepped in once or twice, handling him with the same bored exasperation they face all of our school's problems with. We went to a painfully underfunded school with lots of gang/drug/alcohol/pregnancy problems. And so the security swiftly stopped caring about their jobs, and if you couldn't guess, Horse was a bit of a problem student. The security asked him, Horse, what do you think you're doing? They stole from my friend. Security just gave a deep, exasperated sigh, clearly understanding that they could do nothing about a clear violation of the law of the land, and that the slight Horse it faced demanded swift and extrajudicial retaliation. But also, they did sort of get paid to make sure that these idiot kids didn't lure the flies themselves out of the gene pool all the time. So, some sort of compromise needed to be made for the sake of keeping their jobs. Just don't send him to the hospital, okay? It was a gentleman's agreement, to which Horse obliged. Maybe out of respect for the security guards who dealt with his stunts, or maybe because his knuckles were bleeding, and that kind of sucked. Either way, there was a world of options for making their lives a living hell, and Horse intended to explore as many as he could, at least until they broke and took his ultimatum. Give my friends his stuff back or I won't stop. But they had all weathered a beating. They were high on teenage hubris and also probably weed. What's the worst you could do? Which is an incredibly stupid question to ask about a guy who once begged me to touch the bone poking out of his broken arm. I was crying more than he was. He proceeded to make the next few weeks hell. There was, of course, the petty things. Knocked their lunch out of their hands, swiped homework, locked one of them in the boiler room. Pretty much, if you can imagine a bully from an 80s movie doing it, short of vehicular homicide, what the flip, Goonies, he did it. Then came the heavier stuff. Brought in his dad's bolt cutters. Like I said, security was hot garbage in this school. Alas, only ever watched the front doors, leaving the side doors free to sneak in and out of. And snapped the locks off two of their lockers, as one of them used a master lock. Then proceeded to clear out their stuff. Textbooks, an iPod, which I now own, gym clothes, anything he could get his hands on would be swiped. The valuables would be kept, but things he didn't care about were usually ripped up and left in the hall to be discovered later, along with a broken lock. Their cars were his favorite target by far. He stole their hubcaps, slashed their tires, left deep scratches along the side of their cars. One had a dick scratched into their passenger door. At one point, he borrowed my tire iron to straight up remove one of their car tires and roll it off into the nearby park where he dished it in a patch of dry fenced-off scrub that hadn't been burned back, which would be a real fun discovery for the park department, I'm sure. He had entertained the idea of getting a skunk into one of their cars, but gave up when he realized we live in a city and he had no idea of where to get or how to transport a skunk. Backpacks were snatched as well, mostly dumped in the ladies' locker room showers with the water on, though he did light one on fire if memory serves. Textbooks were free unless you ruined them, and then you had to pay out of pocket, and our school was very generous with what ruin meant. Covers fell off, fine. All the pages are drawn on, whatever. But the whole book was destroyed. Well, they couldn't do anything for you, and had to order a new one on your dime. He tried to tell a teacher that one of them had cheated off him, but given his scholastic history, that was quickly tossed out as dumb and sit back down horse. The final nail in the coffin was ruining a senior's relationship with a girl he'd been dating since freshman year. So Horse had quite a few lady friends on account of being a very large, intimidating guy who would take any excuse. Like perhaps a pretty girl complaining about a creep to start a fight. Needless to say, they were keen on helping him out. One girl, all called Praying Mantis, decided to help in his crusade. She managed to finesse dick pics out of our hapless senior. Of course, he had a girlfriend, but he was also a very horny teenager, and Praying Mantis was a very pretty girl. She sweet-talked him all the way out of his pants, and then proceeded to send every photo to his girlfriend and spin a tale about how she had been blowing him for 6 months now. How she hadn't known that he had a girlfriend, and she felt so bad. Of course, teenage girls are kinda dumb, and Praying Mantis got called a slut and a jerk and all sorts of other names. But come the next day, we still find that cheating senior very much dumped. After about a month or so of non-stop abuse, Horst never really felt an obligation to go to class, so he could spend all his free time on revenge if need be. Teachers just passed him with D's to get him out of their classes. He reminded them of his ultimatum. That evening, lo and behold, nice dude got a knock on his door and his muggers were back. This time, with most of his things in tow. They didn't return everything. I believe a few games and a Blu-ray player were not returned, but nice dude lied and told Horse he got everything back for the sake of ending his rampage. I do want to say that Horse faced some sort of punishment for his many crimes. However, over his career as my friend, he informed me of so many suspensions, detentions, and extra work that he never planned to do that. It all sort of blended together after a while. And I can't tell you how long he was out of school, but I can say that he was a junior, both my junior and senior years. Wrapped him in a blanket and beat him with a cast iron. My aunt was an intensive care nurse at a hospital in Texas for 30 years. A while back, my aunt tells me and my cousins this story, probably as a warning about drinking, I guess. For years, Mrs. Smith would come into my aunt's ER, battered and bruised, apparently sometimes quite severely. The woman was getting up there in years, had almost monthly visits that sometimes required her to stay for a week or more. A quick rundown of some of the injuries I recall. Broken pelvis, explained by falling downstairs in her one-story home. Broken arms and wrists, explained as falling out of her car. A shattered orbital bone in her eye socket. No explanation I can recall. A series of broken ribs with various excuses. Lastly, this moron broke her back, which required fusing 3 of her vertebrates. Driveway car accident. So Mr. Smith is appropriately qualified as a total piece of garbage. On the end of my aunt's 12-hour shift, the call comes in from the ambulance that they're bringing in a 70-year-old Smith. Faces fell. Everyone gets somber knowing that Mrs. Smith probably won't survive the night due to the years of beating she's already endured. The emergency room calls the ambulance back, asking for a description of the injury so the operating room can be somewhat prepared. What they heard on the radio pissed everyone off. The paramedics were completely unprofessional. They were laughing their butts off as they described broken arm, broken leg, and lacerated scalp. When the ambulance pulls up, my aunt and several other ER staff are trying to read them the riot act. Instead, Mrs. Smith primly stepped out of the ambulance. The paramedics pull the stretcher out of the ambulance and wheel her husband inside. Enough is enough. Apparently, that's all she said. The paramedics had to fill in the rest of the story, so here it is. Mr. Smith came home drunk one last time, and she wrapped him in a blanket and beat him with a cast iron frying pan. Mr. and Mrs. Smith never came back to the ER. Maybe he learned. Then Jedi Bell shares this down in the comments. My great-aunt did that. Told me her husband beat her once. She told him if he ever did that again, he would regret it. Several months later, he got drunk and he beat her. She pretended to be apologetic and made him breakfast, invited him to sit at the kitchen table. While he was sitting at the table and prepared to eat, she took her cast iron frying pan and beat him unconscious. He was unconscious for 2 days on the floor of her kitchen. 2 full effing days. When he finally came to, she stood over him with a frying pan and told him if he ever tried that stuff again, she'd bash his brains in and kill him. He never touched her again. He apologized, and they were married for 60 years until he died.